This screencast is going to look at the question called LabCo from section 4, looking at budgetary control. So, as with all the other questions, please have a read down through it. In particular, start off with the requirements so you understand what exactly you're asked to do before you read down through the question. So this screencast is going to predominantly focus on the numerical part B2 and part B3, with just a brief reference to the other parts as we're going through the question. First question asks you to outline the weaknesses of the budgetary control system of the hospital and evaluate the appropriateness of the form and content. So in two parts. One is the weaknesses of the system. So you're looking at here, how does the hospital go about setting budgets, go about using that as a control mechanism in terms of comparing those to actual. So what are the weaknesses in their system? There's a number of weaknesses up there that I want you to have a read through, and they will be put up in the solution again. So you're thinking, are the people who are being measured by the budget participating in the budget? Is their performance being benchmarked based on controllable items, or is there also non-controllable in there? How timely is the system? So there's no point having a control mechanism or a review of performance 3 or 4 months after the performance actually occurred, because then the information is stale. So you can have a look at those, and then also have a look at the appropriateness of the form and content of the report. So part B, part 1 asks you, in the context of budgetary control, explain what a flex budget is and outline its purpose. So again, two parts. What is a flex budget and outline its purpose. So again, we won't spend too much time on that. You can get that from the slides and understand what it is and its purpose. Two things we're going to focus on now is, well, one is what is prepare a flex budget for the blood testing lab for the 6 months to 31st of December. So you know in your question, you're told that here's the report that they're giving. You're told what the actual budget was, or the original budget for the year, the 6 months, and you're told the actual performance for the 6 months was as well. So there's no such thing as a flex budget here. You're just given original and the actual. So the first thing you're asked to do is prepare a flex budget. And note the information here. All materials incurred in the blood testing lab are variable, and the fixed element of labour cost is budgeted at 90,000, and the variable overhead is directly related to the number of tests. So you know when you're doing a flex budget, so we come down here and we copy these down. We'll put the flexed over here. Flexed. The first thing you need to know is, well, what's the level of activity? And you should have read the question as I outlined at the start. You'll know that the level of activity here is measured in number of tests. So the original budget was based on 10,000 tests. So the original budget here was based on 10,000. But the actual, or the number of level of activity, was 11,500. So 11,500 was the actual number of tests. So what you essentially have to do now is flex your budget to say, if we knew that there was going to be 11,500 tests done, what would our budget look like? And so you're essentially coming back to here, saying, going back to CVP analysis. What type of costs are each of those, and how do they behave when the level of activity, i.e. the number of tests, change? You're told in the note, all materials incurred are variable in nature. Therefore, it may be useful at the start to come over here and go per test basis. So what is the cost on a per test basis? Well, if there was 90,000 budgeted for materials and they're completely variable over 10,000 tests, means the cost per test was €9. Okay, so you know it's completely variable. It must have been €9 per test, and therefore you can say, well, if it's €9 per test, you know that there's actually 11,500 tests. The flexed budget for materials will be 103,500. Okay. The next one to look at is, we'll look at variable overheads next, because it's the similar approach. You know variable overheads are directly related to the number of tests. So again, 40,000 over the number of tests, which was 10,000, means you budgeted it would be €4 per test for variable overheads. So using that basis, you'll say, well, if it's €4 per test times 11,500, that means my budget at that level of activity for variable overheads will be 46,000. Okay. The following on to that, we'll finish off with the easier ones first. The allocation of central management overheads, that is essentially an allocation. It would be expected to be fixed. It shouldn't change the level of activity, therefore you just call it, it'll be 100,000 as well. Okay, the fact that it's changed in actual, don't be influenced by that. That is really when you're comparing budget to actual. What you want to do now is prepare the budget as if it was 11,500 tests occurred. The final one then we want to figure out is labour costs. And you're told in the question, the fixed element of labour is, so labour is made up of a fixed element of 90,000. Therefore, the variable element must be the difference, which in this case is 160,000 minus 90. So remember, what would you call this cost? This is essentially labour is a mixed cost. So it's a mixed cost because it has both fixed and variable elements. So we know the fixed element is 90 grand, so that won't change as we flex our budget, but the variable element will. So if we come over here, we know the variable element was 70,000. So 70,000 over 10,000 tests means we expected the variable element of blood testing, so perhaps they get a per rate payment as well as a fixed portion of wages for the workers, is €7. So now our flex budget for labour will be plus. Well, you're always going to have the 90,000 because remember that is the fixed portion, and you're also going to have €7 per test times 11,500. So when you add them up, that is now in your flex budget. Your flex budget, you said you would have expected to have costs of 420,000 if you had 11,500 tests. You actually had costs of 461, so that is obviously an adverse variance. But it's not fair to compare the original budget to actual because they are two different levels of activity. So you're not comparing like with like. So the first thing you need to do was part B, part 2, prepare the flex budget. And this is essentially the flex budget. It's the level of cost items for each line item, resulting in a total cost expected in the flex budget of 420,000. B3 then asks, prepare a table that compares actual and flex budget performance, identifying the key differences, and comment on your findings. So table is number 1, comparing actual and flexed, and identifying the key differences, and then comment as well. So we have our table pretty much done up here. I'll move this over. We're saying actual is here, and the variance here is somewhat from the question. So remember up here we're told -71, but we know comparing original to actual is really meaningless from a control or evaluation point of view. What you want to compare is flex to actual. So we look at difference here. So you said if you did 11,500 tests, you would have expected materials to be 103,000. Materials was actually only 96,000. Therefore, it's a positive variance, the actual, of 7,500, and we call that favourable. That means it's less than expected. So remember, it's a cost, so it's less than expected. Same for the next one is labour. Labour you expect it to be only 170,500 based on 90,000 of a fixed element and €7 per test. However, when you compare it to actual, you are about €20,000 over budget. So we'll call that unfavourable. Same approach for variable overheads and same approach for the fixed element of the allocation. Both of these are unfavourable as well. So what you're doing here is you're comparing the actual to what you expected based on that level of activity, and you're figuring out whether it's a positive or negative. Adding those up means the total of the flexible budget variances is 41,000. So that's the first part of your question. Prepare a table that compares actual and flexed. So you're comparing the actual to what you would have expected at that level of activity. That gets you to 41,000. Identify the key differences. So this is where I want you to identify, look, you originally said that the difference was 71,000. So original difference was 71,000. Of that you can explain some is volume related, so volume variance. Remember, go back to the slides. The volume variance, i.e. the difference in costs due to you performing a different level of activity, i.e. having more tests in this instance is the difference between the flex variance budget and the original budget. So it's the difference between what you thought the budget would be and the flexed. Because you did 1,500 extra tests, you expected to have 30,000 extra costs. So of that 71, actually 30,000 is related to the volume, which may or not be, that will not really controllable by Jack. He just does the tests as they come in. So it's not fair to attribute that to him. That means the flexed budget variances in total equals 41. And you can see, we'll make that a positive, you can see that the sum of the volume variance and the flex budget variance equals the total variance from before. So what you're saying is actually what should be accountable for Jack is only 41,000, not the 71, because 30 of that was attributable to volume. And now let's try and break it down further. Of that 41, what are the main ones? Well, one of the main ones is 25,000 allocation central management costs is 25,000. Well, actually, that's not really a fair allocation to give that or attribute that towards Jack's performance either, because that's an allocation from central overhead. He really had no power in that, you're assuming from the question. Therefore, it's not really fair to say that that's a cost overrun that he should have responsibility for. So again, what you can see is we're commenting by saying what is controllable by him, and you should only be responsible for what is controllable. Therefore, the cost overrun that's controllable by Jack is really just 16,000, which is made up of an overrun of 4,000 in variable overheads, an overrun of 19,000 in labour, and a positive 7,500 in materials. The good students might identify as this is a worrying item, and say we need to investigate further why is there such an overrun in labour. And the very good students will link that into the information in the question, where they realise that they had to do a lot of overtime during the period at hand. So you can see here we have worked so hard, despite the fact that we have not yet got a replacement for one of the technicians. We all chipped in overtime. Therefore, that could be the reason why labour is such an unfavourable variance. And again, that is not fair to attribute that solely to Jack, because he had to work with less team members than he expected. So the logic of that was, of B part 2 is 1, you needed to work out the flex budget and then compare those to actual to figure out, well look, we started with an original budget of original variance of 71. However, some of that was due to an increased volume, right, 30,000. Some of that was due to an increase of allocation, which again, he may not be accountable for that. It may not be fair to make him accountable. And then you're trying to figure out, well, what actually were the overruns? It was good on labour, or it was good on materials, but actually it was worrying more for labour. Okay. So again, go back. This is very similar to the century question we looked at before in terms of the approach, and it's useful to revise that as well. And furniture co. Final one here, in the context of blood testing laboratory, briefly discuss the advantages of using financial performance measures. So again, we talked about this in the slides in week 8, and we'll also touch on it on week 9 as well. What is the benefits of using financial measures for this situation? Well, 1, it gives a common measure across all departments that you can see who has a cost overruns, who is running ahead of budget. So again, that may be useful to compare and contrast both from a performance evaluation across different divisions, but also, for example, you may use it as an analysis to see, well, actually, should we outsource the blood testing? That'll allow you to compare and contrast value for money. So there's a number of other suggestions in the solution, but it's getting students to think about, is financial measures an appropriate measure here in this context? And it gets to talk about further here in terms of what other dimensions should we look at. And that's the crux of what we're going to look at in week 9 is, what are the other dimensions of performance that you should be focused on? Particularly here where it's to do with or blood testing, financial measures are one element, but there's a lot more important ones in terms of quality of the results and accuracy, in terms of efficiency, what are the turnaround speeds, is there customer complaints coming in, and also in terms of skill levels, your staff qualifications, and in particular your innovation. So if there's new blood tests coming on, are you able to facilitate those, and how many of new tests are you doing per year? So just a different perspective on performance evaluation. So that is LabCo for Section 4 Budgetary Control.